Our next speaker is Valerie Bradley, who has come to us from Boston, who's with us from Boston. She's the President Emerita and the founder of Human Services Research Institute in Boston. And her topic is, or what she's been working with for many years, is people with disabilities. And again, it's one of those issues that we don't do enough with. I think it's in the mandate for the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. And both of the two special rapporteurs we've had so far acknowledge that they've done lots on the other thing that's in their mandate to specifically look at, namely gender, but not very much on people with disabilities. So we look forward to hearing you tell us about the recommendation on science and scientific researchers, entailments and ramifications for people with disabilities. Please, Val.
Thanks so much, Helle. And Samantha has offered to help me since I haven't quite mastered sharing my screen. So I'll be asking her to move to the next slide. I just want to marvel at this extraordinary collaboration between Sebastian and Matthias. It really has grown and become a very rich collaboration that's really quite striking. I congratulate you both. My job, I believe, is really to think about both the impact of science, but also the UNESCO recommendations on a particular community, and that is people with disabilities. I think Yvonne said yesterday that the UNESCO recommendations don't confer any substantial rights to any particular communities. But we would be mistaken not to think specifically about how these recommendations and how the impact of science generally affects a very substantial community around the world. Next slide, please. So I think to really understand what I'm going to say later on in this presentation about the impact of both science and the recommendations on the well-being of people with disabilities, it's important to understand the evolution of the disability movement over the last several decades. I'll also talk about people with disabilities as subjects and initiators of scientific research, talk about the digital divide and people with disabilities, which has become an enormously important issue during COVID as people were learning and working and living remotely. Also, the importance of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which unfortunately the United States of America has yet to sign onto. I'm hoping that if the Senate changes, we have a president who's willing to sign it, that 2021 may be the year when we join 194 other countries that have signed that convention. And then talk about the implications of the UNESCO recommendations for people with disabilities and the goals of the CRPD. And then talk a little bit about recommendations going forward. Next slide, please, Samantha. So a little history of the disability rights movement over the past several decades. Next slide, please. I just think this is a very powerful statement that was made in the decision around Brown v. Board of Education by Justice Earl Warren. And in this case, he was referring to race, but it has resonance for people with disabilities as well. To separate them, meaning minorities, from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. And this is obviously a statement that really underlies a lot of the way we feel about discrimination of people with disabilities and the impact on the quality of their lives. Next slide, please. A very important concept that really is enormously important in our field and continues to have resonance to this day is normalization, which is an idea that really grew up in Denmark, in Sweden, and happened really as a consequence of the relocation of a lot of refugees after World War II, but has become the hallmark of a lot of reform in the field of disability, especially intellectual disability. And it's a very simple idea. The normalization principle means making available to all people with disabilities the patterns of life and conditions of everyday living, which are as close to as possible to the regular ways in which the rest of us live our lives. And the implication here is that to the extent you separate people with disabilities and ask them to lead lives that are obviously distinctly different from ours, you other people, quote unquote, you really make them subject to stigma, which has enormous implications. So normalization really, and this really came as I was coming into this field in the 70s, it really sort of infected the way you thought about the world and how people with disabilities were treated. Because it was really impossible after you sort of imbibed this message to look at institutions in the same way, since they were so obviously outside of normal rhythms, normal days, the normal way in which we lead our lives. Next slide, please. One of my heroes is a man named Gunnar Dybwad, who spent a lot of time in Scandinavia talking with some of the initial thinkers in normalization. And I think he really captures the importance of it. But only now I begin to see how terribly important is the concept of normalization. It is a concept that is elegant in its simplicity and parsimony. It can be readily understood by everyone, and at the same time, it has far-reaching implications. So the publication of that book by Wolf Wolfensberger in 1970 was really a very important moment in our field. Next slide, please. The rights movement for people with disabilities was influenced really by a context in which other rights movements were taking place. Certainly the international rights movement, which became
You need to unmute, Val. We can't hear you.
I clicked something on my computer. The international rights movement was enormously important. It grew out of the horrors of World War II. Also thinking about the eugenics movement that really sort of structured some of the toxic ideology that was behind some of what happened in Germany. The civil rights movement, many of us who came up in this field in the 70s were greatly moved by the civil rights movement, and much of the rhetoric and thinking behind that movement spilled over quickly into the disability rights movement. The independent living movement, which was fueled by people with physical disabilities who really wanted to have more control over their staff, over their lives, and there are still very prominent figures like Judy Heumann here in the US who continue to inspire people. The family support movement, it really grew up in the 50s here, and the gentleman, Gunnar Dybwad, who I mentioned, was the first executive of the national family support organization called the ARC. And more recently, the movement, both here and internationally, among people with intellectual disabilities who formed national organization and who, to this day, their mantra is nothing about us without us. Next slide, please. So we've come a long way. We still have a long way to go. Certainly the recognition of the evils of segregation, the soft bigotry of low expectations for people with disabilities, the rejection of dehumanizing and degrading treatment approaches. Really, up until quite recently, there was still something called the CYBIS, which was meant to keep people from harming themselves and created a shock every time they banged their heads. Respect for the uniqueness of each human. They weren't just diagnoses, but each had an individual set of aspirations and goals. And moving to help the field understand through surveys and other techniques what the outcomes were for people with disabilities of the interventions. And realization certainly that the congregation of individuals in large institutions diminished their humanity. And I think we also realized during this pandemic that congregation of people in nursing homes and other kinds of facilities really put people's health at risk. More than half of the people that have died here in Massachusetts lived in nursing care facilities. Also, just listening to people with disabilities and embracing their wisdom. Next slide, please. So people with disabilities as subjects, participants, and scientists. Unfortunately, there's a rather grim history, not that far in the past, of people with disabilities being unknowingly exploited. For instance, there was a situation here after World War II in the 50s, early 60s, where one of our mental retardation facilities created what they called the Science Club that recruited several boys who, in their orange juice every morning, were also digesting radioactive material. Experimental spinal taps on people with disabilities, adults with ID, intellectual disability, given the flu virus, etc. I mean, obviously, one of the most horrible examples of exploitation of minorities was this Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which resulted in numerous deaths and the denial of healthcare to people. That's a grim history that we really need to keep in the front of our minds. Also, I think we're coming to realize that people with disabilities have not routinely been included in drug tests, longitudinal health studies, and artificial intelligence. And I think Sebastian, touched on some of this yesterday, but part of the reason I think is that we've been too cautious about including people with disabilities on the one hand because of issues of informed consent. So how do we structure a system that makes sure that the information about the health outcomes of people with disabilities are included while ensuring that their rights are protected? Artificial intelligence is another very important context where we need to understand both how people with disabilities use it, how they're understood. If you have cerebral palsy and have speech problems, how do you communicate with artificial intelligence? I listened to a presentation recently where one of the AI researchers was basically recruiting people who didn't have disabilities to pretend to have disabilities, which is really not terribly useful. And the views of people with disabilities are rarely solicited regarding priorities that they feel for scientific research, and the ways in which products really design with people without disabilities in mind, how those can be retrofitted for people with disabilities. And I think it's probably also the case, not just in the US, but elsewhere, that routine accommodations for people with physical and sensory disabilities are not necessarily made in labs and in other research facilities. And finally, people with disabilities are really not participants in research studies as collaborators. They aren't consulted regarding the design of studies. And I think we need to think about more participatory research in this area. Next slide, please. The digital divide, as I mentioned, has become critical in the past several months as families are now helping their children to learn online, and as people with disabilities have been sheltering within group facilities and unable to see friends, family, to participate in their usual day activities. So the whole issue of access to the internet has become, and to other devices that help you get onto the internet. For people with physical difficulties, it's sometimes very difficult to really use the internet. Adaptations to make the web accessible are expensive in many cases. Also applications software applications that really make people with sensory disabilities more productive. We have a person here who is blind, and she's fantastic. She does a great job, but not without significant technological support to make it possible for her to do her job. And without that, MISO would have enormous problems. People with disabilities are more likely to be poor and maybe living in places without great internet connections. And our surveys of people with disabilities show that very few of them have cell phones, for instance. During this pandemic, a lot of people were given cell phones so that they would maintain communication, but there's still a divide there. And it's also the case that as the society becomes more technologically sophisticated, people with disabilities may be disadvantaged because of the sophistication. So we need to think about not only access to this kind of technology, telehealth, et cetera, but also supporting people to be able to take useful advantage of it. Next slide, please. Just quickly talk about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As I mentioned, it was signed finally in 2006, 194 countries, and it really was a significant and watershed moment internationally in the field of disability. Next slide, Sam. It exerted a broad range of rights and obligations on the signature states, and it really moved us beyond just medical and clinical issues surrounding people with disabilities, but also really talked about the importance of thinking about people's quality of life and their equal value. It was built on a couple of previous international declarations, including the standard roles on the equalization of opportunities for people with disabilities, the World Program on Action on Disabled Persons, but neither of those two declarations was binding. It was really more aspirational. Next slide, please. The rationale, turns out 10% of the world's population are people with disabilities, and about 80% of whom live in developing countries. Pre-existing human rights conventions were really not exploited to protect the rights of people with disabilities. And people continued to have their rights denied around the world. There was need for both a development of a human rights instrument as well as a policy instrument. So the convention really is a combination of both policy and assertion of rights. There were no legally binding provisions specifically aimed at people with disabilities. Next slide, please. I know the word or the phrase paradigm shift is overused these days, but it was a paradigm shift. And it really moved from seeing people with disabilities as objects of our charity, of medical treatment and social protection, but now subjects with rights, subjects of nations with rights who are capable of claiming those rights and making decisions on their lives based on their free and informed consent, as well as being active members of the society. Gives universal recognition to the dignity of people with disabilities. And in addition to the CRPD, there's also a UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities, a man from Ireland who was a friend and colleague. So we're looking forward to seeing him perform that important function. And as Helle mentioned, a mandate that the UN Special Rapporteur on cultural rights pays specific attention to two groups, people with disabilities and women. Next slide, please. So this is the potpourri of rights that are included in the convention. It is a very wide-ranging set of rights. Right not to be discriminated against, right to liberty and security, freedom from torture, freedom from exploitation, freedom of movement, right to live in the community, which is something that we as advocates for people with disabilities have been fighting for many years. Respect for privacy, right to education, et cetera, et cetera. This is a very rich set of statements that really binds the signatories to this convention. Next slide, please. So clearly, science is absolutely critical in achieving the rights and aspirations of the CRPD in supporting people with disabilities. Because to be included in the civic life of your community, to be employed, to have relationships, people with disabilities need access to science through, in particular, technology, obviously, health advances and other kinds of scientific discoveries. But technology is an enormously important basket of scientific supports. GPS technology, which now makes it possible for people with disabilities who are carrying a cell phone or other device to navigate their own communities, because the GPS is helping them understand where they are, where they're going, where to turn, etc. So a lot of people with intellectual disabilities in particular have been greatly benefited by the ability to have a GPS on their phone. Augmentative communication devices, giving communication, the possibility of communication where communication could not exist previously. Adaptive equipment, which make it possible for people to carry out a range of activities of daily living. Remote monitoring, again, through some of this technology that's become so important during the pandemic. Without our ability to do remote monitoring, at least here in the US, it would have been very difficult to keep in touch with people and to find out whether how they were doing, whether they understood the obligations of social distancing, etc. Smart houses, which allow people who may not have mobility to turn lights on, to turn the oven on, do lots of different things around their homes. Universal design, health monitoring and health aids and prompts, voice recognition software, enormously important. But again, if the voice recognition machines understands people with cerebral palsy and other problems with speech. Durable medical equipment, wheelchairs, walkers, and certainly accessible transportation. Again, a basic need if people are going to be included in their communities, have jobs, be able to see friends, have relationships, etc. Next slide, please. So I went through the 10 basic assertions and recommendations in the UNESCO recommendations for scientific researchers, and just tried to think about, again, from this particular community whose needs I'm trying to reflect, what it means, what these recommendations may or may not mean for people with disabilities. So the first recommendation, and I've shortened the language here to get to the essence, reinforces the values of inclusion and human dignity. Who the heck could argue with that? They're values that are absolutely central to the disability movement. But can we ensure that this aspiration will reach to specific communities? Who's going to be included and whose dignity will or won't be respected? Stresses the importance of tying scientific exploration to identified needs. Needs identified by whom? Will people with disabilities and other disadvantaged groups be seen as informants of these needs? And if so, how will we canvass those individuals so we know what their determination of needs is? 3, dictates that science should drive public policy. Again, who can argue with that, especially in the last year we've lived through? But how do we ensure that policies that affect people with disabilities are data-driven? There's been a lot of junk science over the years pretending to reflect the needs of people with disabilities. So how do we make sure that the science is reflected in our public policy? Emphasizes the role of research as a common good. So how do we persuade scientists and policymakers that investment in research that benefits people with disabilities will result in enhancing the common good? When people with disabilities are well served, we need to continue to say that the society as a whole does much better. But who decides what the common good is? Who defines what the common good is? Declares that entry into scientific education should be inclusive. Again, will it be inclusive of people with sensory disabilities? Will it be inclusive of people with physical disabilities? Will it be inclusive of people who may have behavioral health challenges, who have autism, etc.? And will accommodations be made to make sure that these individuals have equal access into the scientific exploration? Next slide, please, Sam. Asserts that human rights of human research subjects should be respected. What's the balance? Again, getting back to some of the things Sebastian said yesterday. What's the balance between ensuring that people with disabilities are included as subjects versus ensuring that their rights are protected? If we err on one side, we may lose valuable information about people with disabilities. On the other hand, we want to make sure that the shame of the things that have been done to people in the past is not duplicated. Seeks balance between the autonomy of researchers and their rights and responsibilities. So how do we ensure scientific autonomy while ensuring that the needs of people with disabilities are addressed in important policies? So on the one hand, researchers, scientists should have the ability to explore a whole range of possible scientific discoveries, but at the same time, how do you make sure that the priorities of people in various kinds of minority communities are taken into account? Declares the primacy of ethical codes of conduct and concern for the consequences of research. How do we ensure that the consequences of the design of technology, medical intervention, and other devices will benefit people with disabilities? Again, AI, vaccine studies, therapeutics, etc. How do we make sure they're included? Supports the importance of human capital. Will training and performance appraisal take into account the needs of people with disabilities and other disadvantaged communities? And finally, the recommendations point to the need for member states to create the environment necessary for responsible research. So again, will that environment include more participation by people with disabilities as advisors and collaborators? Next slide, please. So thinking about steps that might be taken going forward. First of all, and I think Yvonne mentioned this, that including access to science and the UNESCO recommendations as part of international monitoring of things like the CRPD by the Special Rapporteur as well as the Special Rapporteur for Cultural Rights, finding ways to integrate some of these recommendations as also a context for thinking about the rights and issues coming up in these other domains. Include disability issues into engineering and other curricula to ensure the product development includes access considerations. Again, including people with disabilities in design decisions for products, equipment, clinical approaches that will affect their ability to be included in their community and to live quality lives. Supporting evidence-based practices normed on disability populations. I was at a meeting several years ago with a group of people who had behavioral health challenges, and someone was making a speech about we're moving to evidence-based practice. And somebody said, "You mean that hasn't been going on before now? What have you been doing if you're just now thinking about evidence-based practices?" Include people with disabilities in drug and other testing. Next slide, please. So we really will have to think about informed consent policies if we are going to include people with disabilities. How do we make sure that, again, getting back to that balance, that we don't rule them out because we're oversensitive about their ability to consent, but at the same time, making sure that their rights are protected. It's a delicate balance, but I think it's a really important frontier that we have to think about. Certainly in developing nations, as I said, 80% of people with disabilities live in developing countries, and I'm sure the pandemic has made their circumstances even worse than it was before. So finding solutions to those problems through some kind of low-cost solutions. And finally, supporting longitudinal surveys to track the well-being of people with disabilities and to identify gaps in their access to science-based supports. Thank you very much.